I'm Tim O'Reilly. I'm the founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media, and we're going to be on this morning with Cory Doctorow, who's famous both as a science fiction writer, probably the science fiction writer of the technology community, the guy who has his finger on the pulse of many, many futures, but also a noted activist for issues of security, privacy, user rights. How do you think about these things in the context of technology in the future? And Cory and I met recently in London, and we were talking about the issues that are raised by the Internet of Things. This is Cory's next frontier. As you know, he has been a noted and early proponent of DRM-free publishing. His own books have been DRM-free. His publisher, Tor Books, has published DRM-free for years, as has O'Reilly Media. We find that it's really an obstacle to user satisfaction. And Cory pointed out that this issue of DRM is raising its ugly head in the Internet of Things. And you go, well, what do you mean? And there's a couple of examples that will be familiar to anyone who has a printer, for example. You can't refill the printer ink cartridges in your HP printer because the business model is a razor and blades model. And so they basically have said, no, we're going to put a sensor in the printer that will basically not allow you to use refilled cartridges, only the official cartridges. Well, then along came Keurig, the coffee maker, and they said, well, guess what? We actually have that same plan. Although it was interesting, we saw in just the news just the other day that they now have recognized that that may have been a serious mistake. Anyway, it looks like we're getting Cory now, and since this is really his issue, I'd love to see if Cory can talk to us about his thinking on this point.
Sure thing. Thank you for that, Tim. I'm sorry about the tech problems at this end. I'm sure it was the agents of DRM sneakily messing up my computer.
Yeah.
I hope you can hear and see me okay now. Is that all right?
It's a little funky, but I think let's just move forward.
Okay, well, we'll roll with it then. So, for a long time when we worried about digital rights management, we worried about the consumer side of things. We worried that there were a bunch of things that law allowed you to do and things that you would get more value out of with devices, that because the digital rights management was in the way and because it was against the law to break the digital rights management, you weren't able to do. So a good example of this would be something like DVDs and CDs. If you can remember, when you had CDs kicking around the house, and there came a day where if you stuck it in your computer would say, I detect a CD. Would you like to rip, mix, and burn it, and stick it on your mobile devices? If you took a DVD and you stuck it into that very same drive for no good technical reason, but for a legal reason, all it would let you do is play it. And indeed, if you want to watch those movies again, you have to buy them again. You have to buy them on the iTunes store or on the Amazon store. And I think a lot of people justifiably feel ripped off. After all, Congress wrote a copyright law that says you can time shift and format shift your movies, but because the digital rights management is there, you can't get past it. But that was only for starters, because the longer this stuff went on, the more we realized that the real issue was with security and not with consumer rights. That as bad as it was to not be able to unlock all the value in the stuff that you owned, the much worse issue was that in order to preserve your walled garden, in order to make sure that you didn't somehow sneakily figure out how to trick your device into doing stuff that it was designed not to do, Congress made it illegal to tell people about vulnerabilities in those devices. Because if you know about an error that Apple made when they programmed your iPhone, or if you know about an error that your cable operator made when they designed your cable box, then you could use that error to bootstrap a jailbreak. And of course, these aren't just devices that we use to entertain us. An error in an iPhone, or an error in a cable box, or an error in an Xbox 360 has some pretty potentially grave consequences. Increasingly, these things have got cameras, they've got microphones. You'll remember there was this huge uproar from Samsung when they updated their privacy policy, and they said, by the way, our smart TV that does speech to text, it listens to you. And if you talk about stuff in front of our TV, there's a pretty good chance that whatever it is you say in your living room will get sent around to the rest of the world. And I think a lot of people who were technically savvy said, well, how do you suppose your speech-to-text television was accomplishing the speech-to-text, if not by listening to you? But what I think even those of us who had the technical sophistication to understand that didn't quite think through is that in order to lock your Samsung TVs so that you can't take video out of the HDCP output and then save it in the clear to a hard drive, Congress made it illegal to tell you about mistakes that Samsung made with your television. And TVs, like every other computer, have mistakes. And we really only have one experimental methodology for finding those mistakes, and that's to wait for people to point them out to us. You know, anyone can design a security system that works on people who are stupider than them, but unless you're the smartest person in the world and totally perfect and error-free, that's not going to help you. You need to have other people review your work. That's why we have peer review in the sciences. And so the last thing you want isn't just a TV that sends the audio to other places on purpose, but a TV that's like this long-lived reservoir of digital pathogens that have been put there by script kiddies and people running Monte Carlo attacks on all of IPv4 to find every TV that's vulnerable to it, and then tuning in and using their own speech-to-text to do things like find sensitive conversations and automatically lock in on them. And, you know, as our Internet of Things becomes more and more bound up with this ecosystem walled garden model, the number of devices in our house that you can't know about vulnerabilities in keeps expanding. I mean, for one thing, last year the World Wide Web Consortium decided to standardize digital rights management in all of our browsers, meaning that your browser, which is probably the nexus of control for your Internet of Things house, remember we're supposed to be phasing out native apps in favor of HTML5, the nexus of control for your Internet of Things house and all of its cameras and all of its microphones and all of its other sensors and actuators is going to also be covered by the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and also be illegal to discover bugs in.
Well, so there's really two issues you're talking about here, Cory. The first one is simply the fact that we used to think of these issues of privacy, security, digital rights management as something that had to do with our computers. And then we started realizing that maybe it had to do with our phones too, and now we're realizing that it has to do with all kinds of other devices, our cars, our televisions, our home heating system, our eventually our electronic door lock. We're going to have more and more of these kinds of devices, industrial systems. And so there's the fundamental issue that the attack vectors really change everything from the possibilities of severe programming errors, which then can be exploited by people who wish to rip us off or do us harm. So there's that whole universe of issues, but there's also the universe of issues that are wrapped up in the DMCA, which is because of the legal regime that was originally designed by big copyright holding companies to protect their business interests, actually have this side effect that it's harder to find these vulnerabilities unless you're a bad guy. It's harder to spread information about them, and of course, just as importantly, and perhaps even more importantly, it's harder for us to come up with unintended uses. If you look at the history of DRM and media, entire industries were born because people violated what the original intent was. If you go back to the history of VCRs, for example, the entire notion of the VCR was for time shifting, that you could record a show off of television and watch it later, and they had no notion that people would want to actually rent movies. That actually came out of the hacker movement. There were people, these are big machines back in the early days, and people would get together and they'd link up hundreds of them in sequence to copy movies for each other. And there was this sort of whole sharing, and then people went, whoa, whoa, I guess people really want to rent movies. And the whole video rental market started, out of people, performing unintended uses. And that of course, became the salvation and the next, big revenue stream for Hollywood. And I find it so perplexing that, companies fight the very future that is likely to be the opportunity.
So I think you've put your finger on something here, that there's two questions or two issues. One is this expansion of internet-enabled objects, and the other one is the business model that started with app stores. Really, I think it started with video game consoles, where companies sold hardware at a loss sometimes, or sometimes sold it at a profit, but then ensured an ongoing revenue stream by using cryptography and other tools to make sure that the consumables and the things that were attached to them would have to come from them, so inkjet printers and whatnot. And the success of that business model in this century, starting with mobile devices, has really led the Internet of Things to have that business model as its kind of default. Everybody wants an ecosystem. Everyone wants an ongoing relationship with their customers. Everyone wants software. Now, I think that tells you why it is that firms, when confronted with the possibility of having an ecosystem that lots of people can play in, and having an ecosystem that only they can play in, why they choose that. That an app store model doesn't lack independent software vendors, but those independent software vendors all pay rent to whoever owns the app store.
Mm-hmm.
So what these companies want is they want to have their needed too. They want to make sure that if you're going to you cut them in for a piece, that they don't just benefit because their platform got bigger. They benefit because you actually give them a fraction, a royalty on all of the earnings. They also want to make sure that if you want to disrupt them, that you don't, that you're not able to, that you can only make apps that don't disrupt their existing business relationships. So if you're an Internet of Things company that has deals with power companies to make sure that the thermostat, when it receives the turn down the heat message, so that we don't have to bring the coal plants online, that people can't walk over to those smart thermostats and turn them back up again. So you've made that promise to the power company. You don't want to have a wide open platform because someone might make an app that lets people adjust their thermostats, and even when you've adjusted them down, to adjust them back up again. And so you want to be able to make these promises, because you can get more money from the power company for your thermostat if you can promise them this.
Sure, but it's always short-term thinking. I mean, there is a huge advantage in a winner-takes-all system if you're the winner, first off. And these sort of approaches and business models tend to lead towards winner-takes-all systems. But even the winner in a winner-takes-all system ends up losing, in my experience, over time, because they cut off innovation, they cut off opportunity for other people. And I just have watched this over the years. You look at, for example, what at Microsoft they used to call the strategy tax, which was, okay, we're gonna do these things to lock customers in, we're gonna do things to lock out the competition, and all of those choices, bit by bit, added up to a system that was less usable, that was less attractive, there was less innovation, there was no opportunities for developers outside Microsoft, and eventually all those developers went somewhere else, namely the web, and they built the competing ecosystem that eventually knocked Microsoft off its top position. And then you watch this repeat, and now Google and Apple are sort of fighting over how are we going to lock people into our vertical stack. I just found this recently. I got back from Peru, where I was on my honeymoon, and I was trying to share photos, and we had some photos from the camera, and we managed to suck those into iTunes, and the other ones were off of my phone, and they were in Google+. And getting them into one place was super hard, because there were all these little obstacles that were put in place by both companies, to keep you from sharing, with the other platform. And you look at that, and I go, I'm going somewhere else. and this question of how do you focus on creating value for users and value for a developer ecosystem who are going to invent new things that are going to delight those users are fairly central, it seems to me, for every technology company, but also really really brought home by this new revolution with the Internet of Things. We have a lot of silos emerging, and the question is, where are we going to find that system that allows everybody to work together to create whatever this new paradigm is going to be? It's too early yet to lock this thing down.
Yeah, and I think that one of the new things on this earth is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. That although it dates back to 1998, when firms tried to use it to lock up their verticals, like when Lexmark invoked it for its printer cartridges, and there was a company called Skylink that invoked it for its garage door openers, we were able to successfully argue in court that that's not what the DMCA was for. So the Federal Circuit, when they looked at those two examples, they said, look, the copyrighted work that your DRM is protecting is the DRM, right? The only copyrighted work in your printer cartridge is the stuff that stops you from loading a different printer cartridge. That's not what the DMCA is for. It's way too circular. But these days, you have DRM that sits in front of really substantial copyrighted works that it'd be really hard to argue were not copyrighted works. Entire operating systems, for example. No court's going to say, oh no, operating system doesn't attract a copyright. So now what you've got is this really weird thing, whereas before there was this funny dynamic where, like, if HP sold at a loss a bazillion printers and then really gouged on the printer ink, the fact that they were gouging was kind of a feature if you were an entrepreneur going into the market, because you could say, look, HP has created this landscape of millions of people who want cheaper ink than they're willing to sell. And Jeff Bezos said it. He said, your margin is my opportunity. The fact that HP is charging a 10x markup means that there's plenty of room at the bottom here with my 1x markup to go into that market. And the more printers HP sold into that business model, the more opportunity there was for the little guy to get in and try and take a piece out of it.
Yeah. Let me actually take a slightly contrarian point of view here, and it's one that I'm not sure I can really defend, but I want to, we do have these trade-offs that we make in business models, and I find it somewhat problematic when people want it both ways. So for example, we say, we want all this free content on the web supported by advertising, but let's put up an ad blocker. So other people will suffer the ads and pay for my free content, but I don't have to. And in a similar way, HP has made a choice. They said, okay, we're going to sell you a really cheap printer. I remember when getting a home printer was thousands of dollars, and now it's hundreds of dollars. And we're going to make our money by selling the ink cartridges. And so, I do think that, while I object to the DRM and the ink cartridges, I do think that one of the consequences of letting go of that model might well be that HP says, well, actually, we got to charge a lot more for the printers. And people need to understand the trade-offs and not be kind of entirely on this moral high horse. It's like, same thing with phone lock-in. It's like, oh, the phone companies lock us in. Yeah, they do, but they also subsidize your phone. And then you can be more discriminating about what's the right balance, because all these issues are issues of balance. The phone companies, go, okay, 2-year contract, because I've got to recover the cost of that subsidized phone. But then, of course, they keep you under contract, and they have various games to keep you under contract, and you try to get out, and they try to lock you in longer, and you go, that's when you start to hate them. They made a deal, and that wasn't quite good enough for them. And so I think with all of this, I think we have to actually be smart and nuanced, and not just knee-jerk that all this stuff is automatically bad.
So I hear what you're saying, and what I think is that there are two ways that we can decide how much HP's products cost. The first one is that we can have a market where HP introduces a bit of inconvenience, and depending on how much inconvenience there is, You may pay the premium for their device, or you may go out and figure out how to jailbreak your device. You may buy a third-party thing that you plug into your HP device that jailbreaks it so that you can plug a thing in. And then the market would decide, right? HP could introduce just enough inconvenience and just enough extra cost that you decided to go and buy something. The other one we could do is we could have a law. And, I'm not someone who thinks that all laws are bad. So we might say, okay, HP gets to charge a premium on this to recoup. We'll protect it in contract or somewhere else. But I don't think that what we would say with that law is HP can charge anything they want for the ink cartridges, and we will use an unlimited number of tax dollars to punish anybody who gives you the power to choose.
Absolutely. And I do think that the idea that companies trying to protect their business model, by law, is a mistake. The point really is, if a business model really is a good business model, it should not need a law to prop it up. And so you end up with these distortions in the marketplace when companies go to the government to try to effectively protect their particular approach to the market. And I think that those kind of distortions happen all the time. The thing that I'm most interested in is helping companies to understand how some of these business models are ultimately self-limiting. When you look at so many of the opportunities I mentioned earlier, how the whole video rental market, which became really the major revenue stream, was something they originally fought against. The famous Jack Valenti, the Boston Strangler, quote. It's just crazy. And you look at this like with the App Store. Apple. There are actually some great examples from more recent technology where companies really saw people, hacking their system and went, oh, Apple didn't introduce the iPhone with an app store. People started jailbreaking the iPhone in order to add apps, and Apple went, oh, good idea. And then they formalized it. They built a system to encourage that behavior, and of course created a whole new market. Same thing happened when Google Maps was first hacked, and instead of fighting it, they basically said, oh, this is awesome, and created an API for more people to be able to do it. And I think you look at some of those business examples of people saying, oh, there are people who want to innovate on our platform. Let's help them, and let's build a business model that creates this cornucopia of value creation, versus these stingy business models that say, okay, we've figured it all out, we're going to lock it down, and nothing is going to happen from here. And I somehow I think I'd love to get this out of the, let's protect our business model by law, or to no, let's actually figure out the business models that really, really work, because those are much more powerful.
Yeah, I think that you need a carrot and a stick, right? Like, so you need to say, look, there is a big opportunity out there for you in an ecosystem that's open as opposed to a walled garden or a closed ecosystem. But you also need to say, there is something wrong or sleazy about locking this up, and it is legitimate to take something that has been locked and unlock it, because once you transfer ownership of something to someone, they really have the right to decide how they're going to use it. And if your business model relies on that, you're just, in addition to the fact that you could make more money conceivably by having these open markets, you also don't get to complain, or you at least don't get any sympathy when you complain, when other people start to treat their property as though it were their own. And this brings us back to the security question that I started with. The consumer rights story only takes us so far. At a certain point, you also have to say whether or not, and it's very parallel to your ads example, whether or not ads are good or bad. Ads that compromise huge amounts of privacy, and whether or not software locks are good or bad. Software locks that compromise the ability to report bugs in devices that we rely on have no arguable place to be there. And so if you want to keep ads intact, don't make ads that are as invasive of privacy. And if you want to keep your ecosystem intact, don't punish people who report bugs in it. And you can covenant, like one of the ways we can divide the baby here is if you have an ecosystem, like if you're Zigbee and you've got a consortium, you could say, if you join our consortium, you have to covenant that you will never sue people for reporting a vulnerability. Well,
Yeah.
that would go a long way to it.
Yeah. Hey, I was thinking we should go to some questions that have come
Yeah.
in from Twitter, as well as some that they sourced earlier from analysts. So, John Gray, who's Gray's Spective, at Gray Spective on Twitter, um, wrote, given the skill and sophistication of criminal cyber hackers, both government and non-government, is there a minimal bar or threshold of security and privacy that the everyday connected citizen should expect?
Oh, like if I guess my understanding of that question, if I've got it right, is there are some really like badass hackers out there, so you probably don't have any privacy. Privacy is probably dead. Something on those lines.
Yeah.
And what I would say
Well,
is that
I think he's also asking, how well are we being taken care of by our vendors? You look
well, there's that too.
at the, what we really learned from Sony is that companies just don't even do the most basic practices.
Well, and even there was this story yesterday on Slashdot about the medical implanted medication pump that has an open Telnet listener on the standard Telnet port, and when you log into it, it gives you root on it, and this thing sends drugs directly into people's bloodstreams, and is always connected to the internet with a public IP address. So, yeah, I mean, there's some pretty bad stuff out there. So I guess what I would
Just
say
very
is,
poorly designed.
yeah. So on the one hand, I would say you absolutely should be able to be protected from attacks of opportunity. That crypto works well enough and peer review works well enough and insurance liability is enough of a disciplining factor on firms that all other things being equal, the script kiddie thing where they find a 0 day and they feed it into a scanner that looks at every IP address in the world until it finds your machine that happens to be vulnerable to it and attacks you, that's a thing we should aim for being able to fix. And that also, incidentally, gets us out of spies, because the whole point of spies and mass surveillance is that it only works if it doesn't cost anything to add a new person to the surveillance net. Once Gmail is under surveillance, each Gmail user comes for free. So if the Gmail doubles in user base, you still have the same, cost to spy on all Gmail users. So if we can make it cost something to spy on us, right? If people have to target us and do attacks that are based on knowing who we are and what we're running, that makes us much safer than we are now. We still want to be resistant to targeted attacks, but we can certainly make ourselves largely immune to untargeted attacks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So what about, I guess the real question that I think John Gray is asking, because he has a second question, how can we increase digital literacy to help citizens better secure themselves and ensure privacy isn't simply a fallacy? Whose job is it to get this right? Does everybody have to become very sophisticated, or should we really have a higher expectation of vendors and infrastructure providers to take care of these issues?
So I think that there's less than four factors, right? Larry says that the world is controlled by markets, code, law, and norms. And I think he's right. So you could imagine that we can solve the problem of making people privacy literate with all four things, right? Like we can make it attractive to businesses to want to make privacy-oriented products, and we'll see them in the market. The fact that the Pew study showed that 87% of Americans had done something to protect their privacy since the Snowden leaks, but most of what they'd done had been useless, tells you that 87% of Americans want something that no one's selling. So I think that we're likely to get markets involved. Code, of course, is a very important piece of it. We've had code to protect your privacy for nerds for a long time, and it was really an open question whether the reason that crypto was so hard to use was because it was intrinsically difficult or because the only people who cared about crypto were nerds. And it seems as we get more and more usable crypto being introduced, that it was really more the latter, that because only nerds knew enough about the internet to understand the privacy risks, tools to protect your privacy assume that you're already a nerd. The same way before desktop publishing, all the
Yeah.
software that lets you lay out a page assumed you were a typographer. And as soon as we took on board the project of making typesetting accessible to normal people, we could get a long way, not all the way to where typographers get when they sit down and use these tools, but we could make them usable by normal people to produce things that were far beyond the capacity that they had before. So we can use code to do this. We could use law to do this. We could, for example, change the liability picture for companies for breaches. And we could immunize them from liability in the event that they had taken best practices. So, there's a California privacy law that limits your liability for breaches if you do good crypto with your user records. So, if you lose a bunch of user records but they're well encrypted, that is nowhere near as serious as losing user records when they're in the clear. And insurers basically solve that problem for you, right? Once you say to people you're immunized from liability if you take this one simple step, the insurers step in and say, all right, well, before we're going to insure your business, we want to make sure you're taking that step that means that no one can sue us for our deep pockets. So I think that there's lots of different ways that we can get there, lots of different kinds of steps that we can take to get there.
Yeah. I think, the thing that's sort of interesting here, you're recommending a law in the one case, and the real interesting question is, how do you distinguish between a law that is helpful and one that isn't? And it seems to me that at least one axis that is a pretty clear and obvious test is this law designed to protect a single company or a small group of companies, or is it something that really applies for everybody? I remember John Gilmore always used, or no, I don't remember if it was John Gilmore or Michael Tiemann, but back in the early days, said, his question for lawyers was always, okay, can we just turn this around and if we have these rules for me, would you apply them to yourselves? And this was in the context of open source, but sort of okay, lawyers copy from each other's contracts all the time, yet they were saying, oh no, code is protected by copyright, and you can't do these things. And it's okay, well, which is it, and why is it? And I think in a similar way, you just look at a law like that where you go, okay, yeah, it applies to everybody. It's designed to protect the public, versus the copyright extension, which is designed to protect a few big companies. And I think that kind of general test of law is laws can be trying to protect the public and still be wrong, but at least there's a fundamental premise that the goal is, to protect everybody and not to protect the interests of a particular company.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to say that there shouldn't be no rules, that we should just be arguing about which rules. People who talk about copyright reform are often accused of being anti-copyright. And I'm someone who releases his books under Creative Commons. I use copyright. I don't think copyright is wrong. I just want, I just want to have sensible copyright rules, different copyright rules.
Yeah.
In the same way, I don't think anyone would ever say that no company should ever be liable for anything, right? Mm-hmm. So as soon as we say some companies should sometimes be liable for some stuff, then the discussion devolves to what? And liable for not encrypting records that leak, mm-hmm. That feels like a good one to me, especially in an era in which the best crypto tools are free.
Yeah. Hey, let's move back to the Internet of Things. I'm looking at a question here from @Leah_the_Hunter. She says, which companies and new technologies are most profoundly impacting how the Internet of Things evolves? And also, I guess, how will the Internet of Things evolve in the next 5 years, beyond just more sensors?
I mean, that feels like more of a question for you. You've got your finger more on the pulse of this.
Yeah, well, let me. Yeah, sure. I can take a little bit of that. I mean, I think the biggest mistake people make with the Internet of Things is in thinking that it's about devices. And sure, there are sexy devices, your Nest thermostat, um, your internet connected drone or whatever, and people go, oh, awesome. Um, and yes, and there's things like smart TVs, but the biggest impact to me seems to be when you start thinking about how sensors and devices can change the way you actually do things. And when I first started talking about Uber as an Internet of Things company, everybody looked at me like I had two heads. And I went, wait a minute, come on. It's made possible by mobile internet-connected sensors. The fact that they're in a smartphone doesn't change anything. If you did a thought experiment and you said, oh yeah, there's a special device that lets you call, a car, we would go, oh yeah, Internet of Things, or if the car was a self-driving car, we would say Internet of Things. But the fact is, it's made possible by, mobile, sensors. And so there's going to be a lot of opportunities just using phones and all the sensors in them. And we see that with something like Apple's Health Kit, and some of it, we will be adding new sensors. But what really seems interesting to me is if you take Uber as a model Internet of Things company and use that as your kind of icon rather than, say, Nest, you say, oh, wait a minute, what's really happening here is we're saying once you have connectivity and sensors out in the world, you can actually completely rethink an industry. And of course that's why Uber is so disruptive. And you look at, for example, well, what would the analogy be in healthcare? You think about a home health care worker wearing an augmented reality headset who could be, sort of beaming back images to a doctor, if they needed additional consultation. They're summoned by sensors on an elderly patient who's failed to, do their normal movement pattern. You could say, well, we could completely reinvent healthcare. In fact, there's a company called, I think it's called ChenMed. I'm trying to remember whether it's ChenMed or Chen Health in Florida, which I heard about from Todd Park, where because of the way they've now changed Medicare reimbursements, they've actually, you can actually keep part of the savings if you save money. These guys have actually are doing concierge medicine for the sickest patients because they go, these are people who are showing up at the emergency room multiple times a month. And they're kind of going, we can actually, it's cheaper to send somebody to their house to make sure they take their medications, and we actually get to pass on, we get to keep part of the savings. And you go, that's actually an Internet of Things play. It's like we'll use sensors, we'll use data, we'll use, in this case, it may not actually be all the way to Internet of Things, but it's sort of that, let's change the business model. And just other things, it's like you think about the internet-connected washing machine. You think naively about it, and you say, well, why do I care about my washing machine being connected? And you go, well, not if you're at home, Amazon Dash notwithstanding. But if you're in an apartment building or you're a college student in a college dorm, oh my God, an internet washing machine totally changes the way you think about doing laundry. Because you go, I can see if I don't trudge down there with all my laundry, find out all the machines are full. I don't trudge down there, find it's got 10 minutes more to go. All these things suddenly make sense in the right context. And so for me, the biggest opportunities in the Internet of Things are not new devices and new sensors, but rethinking what people do in a way that we can do them more powerfully, create great user value and user experience because we now have connected sensors.
I'm really interested in the idea of treating human beings as things that are good at sensing and not things that are there to be sensed. So a lot of our
I like that.
Yeah, a lot of our Internet of Things models proceed from the idea that a human emits a beacon, and you gather as much information as you can, often in a very adversarial way about that human, and then you make predictions about what that human wants, and then you alert them. And what if instead you had a device or a device ecosystem that was local to you, that didn't share your information with anyone else, that gathered information that you gave voluntarily because it was just for your own benefit? It was myware and not spyware. And then as you move through the world, other things emitted information about themselves. Your device took them in, looked at your very intimate, not for sharing preferences, and presented you with options. So rather than treating you as like, a kind of ambulatory wallet to try and game into
Mm-hmm.
emitting dollars, the rest of the world, if you think about every offer that every business that you pass today might make to you, it adds up to a gig or two, right? Like we
Mm-hmm.
can handle that in our sleep. Why are
Mm-hmm.
we why are we sending all why are we trying to tailor which information comes to you? Why aren't they all promiscuously broadcasting? You receive them, you filter them at your end using your device that can keep your secrets for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, anyway, I'm sorry, I got a little distracted there tweeting that great line about you. Yeah, I think that the whole notion of, I've sometimes said that the purpose of the Internet of Things is to give humans superpowers. And, you think about it, I think of GPS as a new sense.
Hmm.
It's an augmentation of human beings. I mean, it's certainly true that the Australian Aborigines, had the song lines and they knew how to get around. But for a long time, modern humans have not really had that superpower, and now we do. And I think, we're going to see more and more of that. I think a lot what's happening. I look at projects like HoloLens, um, and other augmented reality platforms. These are, we're heading in the direction of, the Matrix. I want to download some new, skill, and I'm going to actually have this on the spot augmentation. Yeah.
Well, the original superpower, like the one that defines our species, the thing that made the first superhuman thing we ever did was work with other people in cooperative ways, right? Like what two people can do transcends what one person can do. It's literally superhuman. And
Yeah.
economists like Ronald Coase have written at length about how the major project of our species has been to figure out more efficient ways of working together. We have corporations, we have mobile phones, we have churches,
Yeah.
we have terrorist organizations, we have governments, all ways to make us superhuman more cheaply for certain purposes. And where the Internet of Things, where actuators and sensing becomes really interesting, is when you start to think about really low cost collaboration in the physical world enabled by sensors. So in Bruce Sterling's novel Distraction, which is a very prescient book, he has this scene where people collaboratively build a hotel. And they start with this huge pile of bricks, like when you shake out the Lego box and you get the huge pile of everything that goes into your building. They get or into your project. They get everything that goes into the hotel, and they walk over to the first cinder block and they slap a little kind of sticky to it, and it immediately starts talking. It says, "I am a cornerstone. Walk me 3 feet to the left. Walk me 1 foot to the right. Set me down. Find the trowel." Right? And find the cement. And it senses and kind of helps you, and you collaboratively work on the hotel for as long as you want. Then you walk away from it, and the next person who wants to make a hotel in this building walks over and picks up any piece, slaps a little grain of rice sized actuator sensor onto it, and then it tells you where to put that piece now. Right?
Well, I mean,
And
we're already seeing something like that with augmented reality in certain kinds of situations. Um, Daiquiri is a company that has an augmented reality headset for aerospace workers. And it's sort of complex mechanical work, and they're kind of looking at, this is how the part aligns. They're kind of looking with a heads-up display at what they're working on. They're looking, you can also have a worker with less skill go out and look at something because it's automatically providing background and context information. So pretty interesting. So,
mhm.
I have another question here on Twitter. This is from Nicholas Tollervey, or Tollervey, at NTOL. He says, given slow government bureaucracy, how do you affect change to introduce Internet of Things innovation in the public sector?
Well, so this is getting back to Lessig's model of markets, code, law, and norms. So in America, not only is Congress very slow, it actually has effectively stopped making laws that aren't just partisan gamesmanship. The amazing thing about like the cell phone unlocking law was not that they passed a cell phone unlocking law, but that they passed any law at all. But we have this long history at EFF of using courts as a legislator's second recourse, and that's something that the civil liberties and impact litigation world has done for a long time. Not just because Congresses and lawmakers are sometimes dysfunctional, but also because you sometimes see legislative bodies passing laws that are politically attractive, but that
Yeah.
obviously don't pass constitutional muster. And the idea is that we get to make this law that says, everybody who disagrees with us is against the law, and then someone like us goes to court and gets that law overturned. And then they turn to their base and they shrug and they say, we tried, but the activist judges made our crazy law that said, everybody has to have the Ten Commandments tattooed on their forehead. That they made our law go away. And even though we all knew that it would be a good idea. So, one way that you change the law is by going to court and asking for a constitutional review of laws. And EFF certainly is thinking about that in the context of clearing the way for the Internet of Things and changing the way the DMCA works. But also with markets, right? When one of these things all work together. Like you talked about the VCR before, and one of the untold pieces of the VCR story is that over the 8 years that the VCR was litigated, people kept making VCRs, even though the legal status of them was uncertain. And by the time the Supreme Court finally ruled on the VCR, there were 6 million VCRs in American living rooms. All of those judges drove past video rental stores to get to court. And courts are consequentialist, right? They pay attention to the law, but they also pay attention to what their decisions will do to the world. And, for a judge to sit there and bang the gavel and say, all right, 6 million American households now have to get rid of a piece of major entertainment technology in their living rooms because after 8 years I've decided that it's finally illegal, that's something that's hard for them to do. So, one of the things that will help litigation about how this stuff should work is technologies that do the right thing, technologies that go ahead and security audit the Internet of Things, even though you have to jailbreak it to do it, or that offer third-party patches or privacy enhancements. I mean, my favorite third-party tool for Android is the CyanogenMod module that lets me lie to my location sensor. So when I download an app that doesn't need my location but requires it in order to run, I can tell my operating system to lie about where I am. So the app still runs, but it doesn't know where I am, right? So if companies still go on doing the right thing, when we get to court, when we get to that highest court and we're being heard, we'll be able to use the fact that the markets have marched on to do better.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and it really does illustrate a really important point that doing can sometimes be more important than activism. Making something that actually works differently in the world and succeeds can be a very powerful force for change. And so, that's really an appeal to the entrepreneurs out there. If you have an idea that people are doing it wrong, do it right and try to win in the marketplace because you've actually, persuaded people. I look at that in what we've done at O'Reilly and others have done around DRM for publishing. So like we were a lonely voice at first, and now more and more publishers have ended up joining the DRM-free bandwagon because there's enough evidence that it works, that it's no longer an issue. And
yeah, I think that's very true. I think I know that from my discussions with publishers that went DRM-free, the fact that you went DRM-free was a huge piece of their calculus. It was really a force for good in the world, Tim.
Yeah, and as we became a distribution, company for other publishers, and we just said we will only distribute your content if it's DRM free, there wasn't actually an economic incentive for them to join. So yeah, I guess the point is we can make social change for the good by actually our business practices, and that's something I think. This is going well beyond the Internet of Things. I think there really is an obligation for every company to think about how it creates value for society and not just for itself. And we've kind of lost that sense. And there's so many issues, where we're talking. This is a new event I'm working on, which we haven't announced yet, around, jobs, the future of the economy. in the face of technology. You know, that it's not inevitable that you know, companies must maximize their profits and screw their customers and screw the public. That's a choice, and it's a moral choice. And not only that, it's not the most effective choice. It's sort of short-term profit optimization, you know, long-term destruction of you know, the ecosystem and the world we live in. You know, and you see that choice all through our society. And I think we as entrepreneurs, you know, can make other choices and must make other choices.
I think that's really well said, Tim. I really agree with you. I think that, you know, we have all this weird anxiety about AI, and movies like The Matrix resonate with us, even though, you know, our AIs are just nowhere near smart enough to worry about at this point, and don't seem to be ramping up as quickly as we'd hope. But I think the reason that we look at a movie like Matrix and it's plausible to us is that we do have these transhuman, inhuman, immortal creations of our minds that view us as kind of a vector for reproducing themselves and otherwise as a form of inconvenient gut flora, and that's limited liability corporations.
Exactly.
That for most of the time, you know, it's a transformational thing.
Yeah, that's a really great perspective. You know, the non-human entities we built that are actually, you know, hostile, inimical to us are not AIs, they're corporations. That's actually a pretty interesting perspective. But again, they don't have to be. And they can and should be directed by humans, and we need to yeah, take our responsibility there very seriously.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I think that's probably a great place to wrap. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's my wedding anniversary tonight, and I'm going to go run and meet Alice. So.
All right. Give her my best.
On your honeymoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right. Great. Thanks a lot, Cory.
Talk to you later, Tim. Thank you.
Take care.
Good night.